This is the site, Hayle Towans. As you can see, it's quite large. Interestingly, you'll see these revetments and things like that. Now, when you see the other pictures, you'll see they don't show up quite as well from a different direction. And that's the classic thing with aerial photography. It all depends on the light, where the light's coming from. In certain conditions, items will show up. So in this particular angle, on this particular day, the actual items show up quite well. When you see the shot from the other side, where the light's coming from, you see it's not quite so bold. So that's an absolute standard thing for aerial photography anyway. But you can see the site is very large, okay? And these are taken probably 3 or 4 years ago now anyway. But it's still basically the same anyway. So we'll fire off. I'm not sure what's coming up next, but we'll, because it's all gone a bit dark here. Let's find the button first, if we do that. I know why I normally carry a torch. I've left my phone in the car. That's right. No, why don't we get going? Here we go. Right. Okay, the National Explosive Works, Hayle. It was only in use from 88 to 1920. We're going to look at what it was built for, why it was built on the towns, the products, its part in World War I, and what's to see now. So see what I mean with the view from the other side? Those revetments don't. The light is from behind us now, but it's just a different view, just to cover the angles. When you hear me talking about the railway line later, the railway line came in from this direction here. When we do our walk on the 16th, there's the chimney there. We'll be meeting in this area here by the gate, and we'll be coming up and going around here and doing this sort of area here. So that'll be the walk. So we'll be walking down the old railway line there, coming up the hill and going around this area and then coming back down there. So I'll explain that as we go. And the parking's not very good here, so they'll explain that at the end, but we'll be meeting at the gate, starting from the gate, coming around here. This is I won't say the steepest part, but that is the most gradient, and then you'll get a nice view of St Ives Bay when we get to the top. And then we'll be gently coming down again. We'll go and look at Jack Straw's Hill and the Cordite area, and then come back and end up back at the chimney again. Right. The National Explosives Company was formed to build a new facility on Hayle Towans for the production of a nitro-based explosive, dynamite. Now, dynamite's a completely different process to the production of gunpowder, and this company had been producing that at Ponsonooth, Kennel Vale. And the National Explosives Company was started as a new company to concentrate on, at the time, a high-tech chemistry-based project that was both powerful and required great care in its production. As this was the dawn of a new process, they were also pioneers in making the mass production work and developing a safety culture to suit. The safety culture was a very important part. They had nothing to go by, so this site did very well in as much as they developed it, and they also built their own safety culture in, which was extremely good, very good quality, and they had a very, very low issues with accidents. So what we're covering is an era that went from gunpowder plot, Nelson, Drake, up to jet fighters. So that's the area we're covering with the products. So we're going from gunpowder, which is basically what they make fireworks from nowadays, to dynamite, which is a completely different product, and we'll basically have a quick look at what the difference is. Right, the process for the manufacture of nitro-based explosives was completely different to that of the traditional gunpowder and utilised complicated chemical and chemistry input, but on an industrial scale. The process required lots of space, plus some elevated sites to start production. Because of the sensitive nature and power of the products, the process has to be spaced well apart and have protective bunds around them. The production units were only allowed to be staffed by very few people in one unit, and the towns at Hayle had plenty of space, was close to the transport system of the day, and the terrain lent itself to easy construction of hills and bunds. Right, let's look at the difference between gunpowder and what they were going to make is the dynamite. The use of gunpowder went back centuries, and result of making fire, as they used to call it, and it was a powerful tool for both arms and mining. The gunpowder is made from a mixture of charcoal, sulphur, and saltpeter, which is ground in mills into a granular form that burns very quickly and will give an explosive effect if contained. The powder is ignited by a flame or spark. You've all seen the classic cowboy films and the old films where they have a keg of dynamite and they leave a trail of powder and they light the powder. That's what gunpowder, that's what it was like. That is what it's like. You can have fuses, but basically it has to be dry. It can be lit literally with a match or even a spark, and consequently it's quite dangerous in some respects in that respect. The product has to be kept dry to work. Therefore, it is difficult to store for instant use. If it's damp, it just doesn't work. So that was always another problem with it. Also, the powder can be accidentally ignited by a stray spark, which makes it dangerous to handle. Another very easy thing to happen. Many years had been spent looking for a replacement product, and it was chemical-based experiments that showed the way ahead for a nitric acid, nitro-based products that eventually became dynamite. Nitro-based explosives are not ignited, but they're detonated, therefore reducing the hazard of accidental ignition. However, the path to producing a safe-to-handle and use explosive product would require much application of experiment and testing, with great care being the watchword. So, whereas you can light gunpowder with a fuse, or you've seen flintlocks, all those classic things you see tonight, they're all gunpowder-based. Dynamite has to be detonated, and it's usually detonated with a fuse. In other words, you need a small explosion in the dynamite to detonate it, and then you get the biggest explosion after it. So dynamite is usually detonated with a fuse. The fuse can be electric, and it can even be made out of black powder itself. But you have to have like a little mini explosion to get it going. If you've got a small bit of dynamite, put it on a brick and hit it with a hammer, it would go bang, like it would with the old caps in the caps gun. So that's the main difference. You light dynamite, you light black powder, but you detonate dynamite. So this is the site itself. Okay, we'll come on to that later. We'll go through a few things later because I'll go as we go here. There's a railway line that runs down there. We'll be starting the walk here, and we'll be going down the railway line here and coming sort of up this way. This is New Nitro Hill here. This is Jack Straw's Hill. I'll come into that later, and I'll go into some of the production. This is where they made the sulfuric acid and the gun cotton bit. And this area here, where all the machinery was to drive the plant, the compressors and the engines to drive the plant. And this area here is where they actually, and all this is where they actually produced the products. Right, dynamite production is what Hayle, so all that Hayle Towans ever did was make a dynamite-based product, which is basically a nitro explosive. The new nitro-based explosive had many advantages over gunpowder, very complicated and difficult to manufacture, and needed a very strict safety code to reduce accidents. The critical part of dynamite manufacture was the requirement to first make nitroglycerine. So we'll have a little chat about that in a minute. That is the base product for dynamite. That formed the product base. This was only one of the many sensitive production areas that needed to be addressed, and why Hayle Towans took on the mantle of a giant chemistry set. We have to look at this in some detail so as to understand how the location was designed to safely produce such a product on an industrial scale. Right, the hills. When you make dynamite, they talk about hills because the product is made and it's a fluid to start with, and has to be allowed to gravitate down through the processes. You can't use pumps, and so it has to be allowed to naturally gravitate through. So dynamite starts its process, which is basically making the nitroglycerine, on the hills, and this is still a word they use now, dynamite hills. As in any factory, many subsidiary actions were feeding the main production unit. Because gravity was to be used to actually make one of the base products, nitroglycerine, the process was started on a suitably equipped hill to the north of the main complex. Now, originally, that was what we will see in a minute, Jack Straw's Hill. And that was the first production area for dynamite at the Hayle Towans, and was indeed the focal point of the explosive manufacture. Starting at the top would be tanks of nitric acid, water, and glycerine, and here nitration would take place to start the process. When a suitable mix was ready, the liquid was allowed to flow down to separation and pre-wash unit, and then to a final wash tank. When the product was considered ready, the pure nitroglycerine was then allowed to gravity, this is important, was allowed to gravity slowly down into a store tank for onward use. The entire process was safety critical. If any time in the process it ran away, it was getting too hot, they had a system where they could divert it into basically a large tank or pit of water, and they were called drowning tanks. We'll see those on the walks. So the drowning tank was available to divert the mixture into a water bath to prevent a dangerous situation. Now, the other interesting thing is, having diverted it into water, you could actually recover you could actually recover all the basic materials, the acid and what was, if there was nitroglycerine in there, you could and reuse it again. So it wasn't a complete waste, as it happens anyway. At the time, Jack Straw Hill was considered to be the most suitable layout available, but there was an unexpected glitch that came to light later on. Right, let's look at the products. So before dynamite became available, dynamite is the latter use of nitroglycerine. So we'll just go through this quickly. Before dynamite became available, there were earlier nitro-based products. So they knew that you could make an explosive from nitric acid, but it was very difficult to actually handle or use in a practical way for obvious reasons, as we'll see in a minute. Nitro-based products had been discovered that were very powerful and not dry critical. That's another thing. You can use them underwater in certain conditions. They start off as a liquid, so that's not a problem. So it's not a question of them getting damp and you can't use them. So they were very, very useful. And they were based on nitric acid, and this is all that Hayle was ever involved in. Nitroglycerine was a liquid oil produced from nitric acid and glycerine. This is the base product of dynamite. The production process was both critical and non-tolerant to a casual approach. The final product was very powerful and had to be detonated, but being a liquid, it was difficult to apply in both arms and mining. Now, if you think about when someone loads a musket, you see them pouring dynamite in there, or when they charge a hole in a mining situation, they pour the powder in. Well, you imagine trying to do that with a liquid. You just can't do it. It doesn't run uphill to start with. So that was one of the problems with nitroglycerine, apart from the fact it used to go off very easily as well. Now, so nitroglycerine was a very powerful explosive, but it was very difficult to use. But it eventually became the base in dynamite. Gun cotton utilized the infusion of nitric acid. This is another pre-dynamite thing. Was used in nitric acid and cotton waste, which resulted in a product that could be used in shells or mining with care. However, its production was hazardous, very hazardous. It was virtually banned eventually, and therefore its use became limited, although it would eventually find a home in cordite. So these are all kind of things that are going to come back in later. As we will see, both these products will be part of the main production element of the Hayle Towans Works in the Great 1418 War. Bing. So that's the classic sort of way that dynamite is actually packed, in tubes like that. It's like there's a paste in there, and as you can see, it's quite neat. If you picked that up and dropped it on the floor, it wouldn't explode. If you put a match to it, it wouldn't explode. So in that respect, it's quite safe. The decision to build the National Explosive Company at Hayle also included the provision to manufacture much of the base materials on site. So to that end, the location set up to produce both sulfuric and nitric acid, gun cotton, nitroglycerine, and also process the fine Kieselguhr earth, Gur. Because what dynamite is basically nitroglycerine mixed with a fine earth. It doesn't have to be earth. It's virtually like a talcum powder. You just need something to absorb the material to make it into a paste. And that was what Nobel basically had come up with. So this was basically a way of making nitroglycerine safe to use. And the reason he used Kieselguhr, the earth, was because they had, where it was in Germany, they had natural beds of this stuff. And it's like a loam. It's a very fine, almost like a talcum powder. They've also got natural deposits in Scotland, which, as it happened, ended up as producing dynamite later on as well. So it used to be called Kieselguhr. Later on, they used all sorts in. They could even use things like sawdust. You just needed something to absorb the nitroglycerine. But the beauty about the Kieselguhr was it would absorb a lot of moisture, so it made it very, very powerful. It was a bold decision at the time, but to prove its worth when bidding for future government contracts, which meant that large increase in production capability. Because the site was laid out from scratch, it was possible to organise the layout in the most efficient way on a factory basis, with more materials being kept separate from the process area. I'll explain that in a minute. Eventually, a rail line was laid from the Hayle wharves, and the site had its own tramway system for movement of material. A substantial power area contained the various engines, generators, compressors, and pumps, and a gentleman called Oscar Gutman was brought in as a sort of mega consultant to oversee all this, and he had considerable influence in these sites, design, production, and the all-important safety culture. Am I going the right way? Oh, yes, I think so. Let's have a look. Yeah, right. So this isn't all the site, but this is basically what we're looking down on now. So the gate is here. That building actually is a later building, so that wasn't there when the site was built. So we will be walking down the railway line, and down here where it says number 1, there's a railway siding there. Now, those of you who've walked down there, the number of people I've spoken to who've walked down there for years never realised there was a railroad platform there. I mean, there's actually a railway platform down here. We'll see that on a way. We'll then be coming up here. This is new. This is the later hill. This is the hill they built when they needed more production. So this is Jackstraw Hill. This is where these are what called cartridging huts. They show up very well from the air. This is where they mixed the dynamite, the nitroglycerine with the GUR to make a paste, and they would then form that into those tubes you've just seen. As we get down here, as you come down the hill, we get to more where the nitroglycerine is stored before it gets used to mix it. So the process starts at the top of a hill with the nitration. They pre-wash it and wash it, and then eventually up with pure nitroglycerine down here somewhere, and then that is taken to the various places to be mixed into a paste. When you get to places like that, these are store areas around the back, and there's several of those all around the site. And the cartridging, which we'll look at next week when we walk around, they're in small units all around this area as well. And mainly there was 2 people working in each of those in a wooden hut. This area here, this is the only visible sign of any of the tramway left there, which we may or may not see when we walk around, but that's the only visible sign of the tramway crossing there. Here we've got Jackstraw's Hill up here. So this is the original production area here, which is a much smaller hill. Even here you can see it's much shallower here. These are areas where the product used to end up in various revetments. Because the whole site went on to cordite eventually, this area here was where the cordite presses were. And down here, in actual fact, there are some big engine power bases there, which is obviously part of that. There's a picture of that coming up in a minute. This is the main walkway into the site, and there was the laboratory there. This is where the nitroglycerine was made. This is where the gun cotton was made. So the stuff would come in by the railway line. This is all those sort of products were made there. All that basic product was there. But the nitroglycerine was actually made on the top of the hills. It was allowed to gravity down, and that's when it was mixed to make the final product. Now, talking about, but these are sort of typical of the buildings that would have been around. This is interesting because if you look at that picture there, and you'll see that dune has been blown out there. So it's quite easy because that's what it's like now. So that's quite a. I didn't realise when that was taken that was going to show up as well. So that blowout there has been there a long time. So that's quite interesting. This is the cordite site, which is later after they'd wound down on dynamite and was making government contracts for cordite. We'll talk about that in a second.
So excuse me, can I just ask? They actually built those hills,
did they?
Those hills are not part of the dunes.
No, these are the protective bunds or revetments. You can see there. You can see these are sort of a close-up of them. So these are man-made, okay, and they show up particularly now because they're sort of straight edges. and sharp. They actually show up quite well in the aerial pictures, which will come on later. When you're actually on the ground, it's sometimes difficult to see this. I mean, they're not like that now anyway, because they've weathered for 100 years and some of them they've just eroded. But when they were brand new, the grass would have been kept short and they would have been very obvious. But it's still much easier to see them from the air than it is from the ground, particularly now because they've sort of blended in with the natural dunes. Are we going the right way? Yeah, well, it's not too bad. Yeah, so here you've got a mixture of there's a particularly good, you see there, that row there, that's a row of cartridging huts, whereas some of these other bits here would be natural, they're man-made, but you can see that's quite a good angle, that, because there's a whole group of them there in line, and that shows up quite well. Now on the ground, that doesn't show up as well as that, so that's why when we're walking around, I'll just have to make sure I stop somewhere where you can see that to make it easy. Anybody else want anything quick before I? And these are in the woods, which sometimes in the year you can't hardly see them. But this is what's sort of hidden away in the undergrowth. This has happened to be a particular time when it had either, I don't know if anybody went in and cleared it or what happened, but it suddenly sort of sprung up one weekend, and I quickly took a picture of it. So these are the foundations, obviously, where they had some engines and compressors and bits and pieces to power the cordite area. So these are quite substantial foundations, these. So this was all part of the other power area, which was built later. So there's that blowout again, and here is the Jack Straw's Hill here, and these are the various places where this was the nitroglycerine store there. We're going to talk about that later. That's where it ended up as the pure nitroglycerine there, and they had a bit of an accident there in 1904.
So Peter, when you say the blowout, is that?
I mean, when I say a blowout, I mean it's just a natural with the wind and it got eroded.
Right.
But it just shows you how long. When you look at that black and white picture, which is 100 years ago, when it was like that then. So it's just got bigger, right. But it's a good reference point. That's what I'm saying. All right. When you look at an old picture, I was quite surprised it went back that far. Right, we'll have a look at a typical. Now, this is the original production area of Jack Straw's Hill, and so you start off with acid tanks up the top of the hill, and there'd be glycerine tanks there as well. They would then be mixed in these little revetments up there, which would be like a smaller version of that. That's where it would be nitrated. It would then be gravitated down into a pre-wash to get the acid out of the mixture, and there was another pre-wash over there. Now, this has all been allowed to flow down in open launders had a bit of a cover over them, into no pumps, and so it was all allowed to flow down through these open launder systems. You had a pre-wash here, another pre-wash here, and then it would both go into a final wash to get all the impurities out of it, so you're left with pure nitroglycerine. This was allowed then, when they were ready, to trickle down into the final nitroglycerine store. Okay, so we start off with the acid and the glycerine tanks up here. Nitration is what they call the process when they mix the two together. That's a fairly critical process. We could spend 2 or 3 days talking about that, so we won't be doing that now, but there's plenty of books on all that. Then you have there's two pre-washes to start getting the impurities out, and then you have a final wash, and then the pure nitroglycerine is allowed to flow down into the nitroglycerine store, and from there it's carried to the various mixing bays where it was then taken to be mixed into either dynamite or laterally cordite. So that is the basic process, and that's why it's on a hill, because it's all gravity all the way down to the final nitroglycerine store. This area here is the latter. It's where they processed the cordite, where they made cordite and dried it, and it's a similar process. This part of the process is exactly the same. The difference with cordite is what you mix the nitroglycerine with. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now this is The gate is there, by the way. So that's the road is the Gwithian Road's coming up there. Okay, the gate's there, chimney's there, and this is where all the engines were. The steam engines, the generators. So they're all still there. The bases are all still there. It would have been a very, very busy area with chimneys and lots of smoke, etc. So this is where all the power and all the compressed air and everything they needed in that respect was all generated in this area down here. You see that quite well. This is where the nitric acid was made and the other components down there. There we go, right. So having produced your nitroglycerine, it's then mixed with the gur to form a thick, smooth paste suitable for forming into classic dynamite tubes cartridge. It's like a sort of porridgey plasticine, really. They roll it into tubes into whatever lengths they particularly wanted it. And to do that, small quantities of nitroglycerine will be taken to a mixing hut or cartridging hut and introduced into a measured amount of super dry gur. And then that would be hand mixed into a paste until the right consistency was achieved. And then the paste was then taken to the cartridging huts for the final forming, wrapping and packing. It was like squeezed out through like just like a giant sort of toothpaste tube, but it was slightly more scientific than that because it was a fixing, not a fabric thing. So they were squeezed out. They put the paste into a container and squeeze it out into tubes, into cardboard, into a wrapping, and fold up that, and then into the classic dynamite sticks that we see, which are about sort of 8, 9, 10 inches long and about 1.5 inches wide across. So that's how that went. All hand done, all done by hand, then into boxes, and that's called cartridging. So that's what the Hayle production site started. That's what it was producing. It was producing dynamites. You could have different types of dynamite because coal mines needed something that produced it without a flame, so that you could alter the mix with different things to alter the different types of dynamite. But the basic dynamite that's used in granite quarrying and things like that is what they started with. But that could be adjusted to suit specialist mining work where there was a problem with fire, which is obviously what you get in coal mines with gas. Anyway, the mining industry, as we all know, was quite volatile. So when government wanted to have cordite made for armaments, etc., Hayle was actually very well set up to have tendered for that new work when it came along.
So much of it being done kind of handmade and with health and safety not being the same as it is
Health and safety,
nowadays.
there's no such thing.
No. So do people kind of have an exposure to those chemicals?
They used, this is the classic dynamite stick here, right? That's been hand rolled and the ends pushed in, and there's a paste in there, which is the pure dynamite paste in there, and that's the thing where you'd put a fuse in the end to detonate it. Now that would be rolled and done by hand, and they used to reckon that the ladies who worked there, if they were been there any long time, they would turn slightly yellow, and they were called canaries. But I don't know how long you had to do that and whether they were supposed to wear gloves and didn't wear gloves. But certainly exposure to them did actually. I think it wasn't a permanent thing, but there was this. They do talk about them being canaries, which I no doubt is due to the fact that they were, actually handling the product all the time. Yeah. I think they're making gun cotton there, but that's a sort of typical. This isn't Hayle, by the way. This is a place up in Scotland. There are no images of Hayle, or not much in the way. So, Gretna Green, that is Gretna, yeah. So that's typical sort of. It's all very much a hand product, and they had some horrendous accidents up there. I mean, when they had accidents up there, it would kill 100 people. So but they were producing huge amounts in actual fact. Am I going the right way? Yeah. As with any new technology, the explosive. Now, this particular, don't forget, they had nothing to go on here when they built this. When they built this establishment on the Towans, they couldn't get a book out of the library. The Beginner's Guide to Dynamite. They had to sort of design it the best they could. And this chap Gottman, he did a very good job on this. But they had to design everything themselves, the safety culture and everything else. So they did really learn as they went along. And they did very well, but they had this incident in 1904 that caused the main nitroglycerine store to explode a huge quantity of pure nitroglycerine. The main blast, because it was in a revetment, went up. It was a huge blast. They felt it in Torquay and places, and it broke windows in St Ives, apparently. It was a massive, massive blast. But because it was in a revetment, it didn't start a chain reaction to the other product areas. But what it did, there was still some, because the actual gradient from the final wash to the nitro store was quite shallow, there was still some nitroglycerine in the launder, in the pipe. It's not a pipe, it's an open pipe, it's called a launder. So the explosion propagated up there, and it blew the final wash up as well. So it killed 2 people down in the dynamite, in the nitroglycerine store, and they don't really know why. They think perhaps a lid was dropped. They don't really know, obviously, because there's nothing left. And that propagated up the pipe or up the launder to the final wash and blew that, did a huge amount of damage up there, and blew a lot of pipes down and all the launders. And of course, it rather knackered the safety system, because they couldn't actually, because there was products being made all the time, they couldn't divert it to the drowning tank because all the pipes had gone. So they had to seek to get volunteers to actually do that by hand, and which they did. And so here we have the final nitroglycerine store. This is where it happened. We'll end up the talk and the walk ends up in that sort of area here. And so this was a nitroglycerine store. That blew, and you can see that was where the product would have come down in its open pipe. That's quite a shallow drop, okay? And so there was still a trickle of nitroglycerine in that pipe. So it blew the final wash, which around this area would have been festooned with pipes and launders and so it did away with all the normal things, all the normal pipes and gullies, etc., caused an enormous amount of damage there. So they couldn't actually divert what they were making into the drowning pit, which is there. So they had to get volunteers to actually empty the various things by hand. So that was the most serious accident they have. But it was a huge explosion. But they learnt from that. That's the important thing. And that's the other reason you only have very small numbers of people working in various places. So, you get 2s or 3s or 4. You wouldn't get like 20 people, and they're all protected by these protective bunds like this, which sends the main explosion upwards. Where are we now? That's I've got to try and. There we go. I'll get my sauce. Oh yeah, here we are. Different. So I haven't done this for 3 years. So right. So this is Jack Straw's Hill again. So the nitration has taken place up here. Let's just get my bearings here now, because the drowning pit is there. It's come down here. This is where the final gully was, here, and this was the nitroglycerine store here. This is the one that actually blew up, and it's just a different angle, and the final wash was there. The drowning pit was there, which they couldn't use in the normal way because all the pipes had been blown up as well in that whole area, and consequently they had to handle that in buckets to stop the process. So, and that was the problem. The explosion started here but flashed back or detonated back to the final wash there. And it killed 2 people there and killed 2 people there. We'll be visiting both those sites. Right. Now, cordite is made from nitroglycerine. It's the government's replacement for gunpowder for firearms and heavy guns. It has a more controlled expansion force than dynamite. So what cordite does, it pushes it pretty quickly, mind you. It pushes rather than shatters. If you put dynamite into a bullet, it would blow the breech of the bullet up because it explodes too quickly. So what cordite does, it's a dynamite that actually, and they call it burning in actual fact, it burns slower. And so you end up with a controlled push, still very quick, we're talking about nanoseconds, but instead of it shattering what's around it, it pushes. And that's why they use it for firearms and shells. Okay. Now the difference is, and it became a standard propellant, which even was used for rockets. Cordite required the base content of nitroglycerine, but instead of mixing it with Kieselguhr, it was mixed with gun cotton and a small quantity of Vaseline, and that formed a very thick paste, and that was put into dies and squeezed out, because you use cordite in different sizes. You'll see the pictures in a minute, it'll be obvious. So cordite's used in ammunition. It's not used for mining, it's used in ammunition, it's also used in rockets. And in actual fact, one of the early uses of cordite was in ejection seats. When ejection seats were designed, when the first jet aircraft came out, it was cordite that was used to actually blow the seat out of the aeroplane. Just ordinary cordite in a cartridge form, as opposed to dynamite. If you put dynamite in it, it would have just blown the whole aeroplane up. So that's the difference between the two. Right, I think there might be a picture coming up for that. Let's have a look. Oh, that's to show you where the main cordite area was. I think, and that's interesting because the Wildlife Trust had just obviously done some clearing here. So I think there's another picture coming up. So there would be dry. This is where the cordite area is. We should see where that blow is, Gwithian in the background here. This was where the main cordite area was set up, and that's where the extrusion. So the paste would be extruded into lengths, and it'll be obvious when we see slide coming up, which is the next one. I think it shows you why. Bonk, there we go. So that's what's inside us. That's an old 303 bullet there. That's what's inside an old 303 bullet. Rods. They are rods of cordite, as opposed to a powder. So, and when that's detonated by a cap at the bottom here, which is basically a detonator, in a very, very small detonator built into that part of the bullet, causes a mini explosion there, which detonates this, and which burns extremely quickly and pushes that bullet out of the gun. So that's why cordite is used now. If you put a similar quantity of dynamite into that bullet and fired it, it would blow the breech of the gun to pieces. That's the difference. And that's what it's like in a shell, in a large shell. These are cordite, and now these are much longer lengths and thicker lengths, and they're cut and bound, and that's what's inside a shell. Cordite again. This is a cordite shell. This is a shrapnel shell. So that's got lots of small things, and that's the use of cordite in a shell, not dynamite. Right, the expansion of cordite production needed a considerable increase in all facilities, plus the provision of extrusion equipment. Much of it was made locally. Holman's made a lot of that, and they're giant sort of. If you imagine the effect of a hydraulic jack pushing something through a die, then you can push this paste out through various size holes to make the different sizes of rods that you want. So you can make whatever size you want, and then you can cut it to length. But then you have to dry it. It has to be dried before you can use it. Dynamite, you can make it, and you could use it the next day. You can't with cordite. You have to let it dry off. So they had to have quite a few buildings around, not buildings, but revetments around the site to dry to let it dry off. And the thicker the cordite rods, the longer it took to dry. I think we'll go through there. Oh, right, here we are. This is new.
How did they construct a hill?
Sorry?
How did they construct a hill?
No, they didn't construct. The hills were natural. They didn't make the hills. They used the natural terrain for that.
But it's all sand, is it?
Yes, basically. Yeah, it is basically. It's all part of the towns. So this is New Nitro Hill. This is where those amazing bases are at the top there. Taken from this, same as the sea. This is taken from this angle because it just shows the buns up quite well. Nitration would have taken place at the top here. Again, in this particular case, they found that if they cooled the mixture, then it increased the speed of the actual process. So they actually had a refrigeration plant up there to cool it down as well, and then that speeded the whole thing up. There's the drowning pit there, okay, And as you can see, it's flowing. The process is all coming downhill, and the pure nitroglycerine will then end up in a store here, ready to go off. Now, this was a faster process safer process because they had more drowning tanks. There's another drowning tank there. There's a drowning tank there, and they also had a steeper flow, so there was less danger of anything going backwards up the system. These are the bases for the acid, so there'd be huge vats of acid sat on there, which was brought up on a little incline, which we'll see on the walk. So they couldn't be pumped up. That was brought up basically in a cart. In some cases, you could use compressed air to move things around. You could actually do that with acid, but in this particular case here, they brought it up in a large cart, and these tanks were filled with nitric acid. That's quite a big thing when you get up there. Get a good view of Snides Bay across there. So you've got nitration taking place, and then you've got the washes, and then the product is ending up down here as pure nitroglycerine. And then the area flattens out then, and then you get into the mixing area. So anything on the hill is the process. When you get down to the flat, it's storage or mixing. Right, Hayle was producing cordite for the government before World War I, but then considerable expansion in production was required after 1914, and a huge increase in the workforce. The female workforce increased dramatically, and at its peak, they reckon there was some 1,800 workers to keep the production up. Now, they would have been working, they wouldn't all be there together. They'd have been in like some sort of shift system. And I don't suppose they were all on site. There would have been ancillary things feeding the site as well. But that's what they reckon. They reckon that 1,800 people were actually employed generally. This meant that a large number of women that were employed on the actual danger area on numerous tasks. They shared the same risks as the men, and on December the 20th, 1916, 2 were killed in an explosion in the cordite production area. I think that's the only recorded incident. And they're buried in Philip Churchyard, and they're buried side by side, and that's what's marked on their graves. So considering what was going on there, it really proves that they had an incredibly good safety culture. That was one of the very, very few problems that they had there. But tragic it was, and it was an unusual occurrence. It proved that despite the huge pressure of wartime requirements, the Hayle site was essentially very safety conscious, and at the same time efficiently manufacturing large quantities of a powerful explosive. The risks associated with production were immense, yet Hayle managed to do this with very little loss of life. By 1918, Hayle was really only producing cordite for the government, and the commercial explosive business was very low. With the end of hostilities, cordite production ceased, and with no private customers to serve, the plant closed, and most of the staff were laid off. As it had already been decided that the majority of the wartime plants, this is all over the country, were to be closed, Hayle fell silent and demolition began, together with the burning of surplus stocks of explosive. So you can actually burn cordite, you can unwrap it, and you can actually burn it. It won't explode, so you can actually, you can just literally put a match to it and it will burn for quite. So the way they got rid of the burn with cordite was they actually burnt it in most cases. They didn't explode it; they literally could just burn it. If it's uncontained, it's relatively safe. It's only when it's in a container and it's detonated that it becomes dramatically impressive. So imagine the effect of this was in 1920. So that in the effect of employment in the area was dramatic, and they dismantled the location, but they didn't actually dismantle it. They destroyed it because effectively, ICI, what became ICI, were given the job of decommissioning these various places, and they made sure that none of their competitors' sites were going to ever be able to come back into production again, which is why it was never available in 1939 to make explosives again. And the most of that was then moved up to Scotland, where the huge factories were. So there's lots to see as regards the bases of. There's obviously the bases to see. But without the buildings there, you have to visualize the buildings. You have to visualize miles of pipework, compressed air pipes, electricity lines running across, all on wooden poles. It would have been a real sort of look like a bit of like a shanty town really, with low wooden buildings surrounded by a revetment or a bund. And of course the bunds are all still there. And when we walk around there, and what looks like a path is where a pipework would have run. So I'll explain that when we walk around. The drowning pits are all still there. The hills are obviously still there, and the bunds are still there. But of course, certain times, now the growth has sort of taken over. Certain times it shows up quite well, other times not so well. They do show up better with the aerial pictures. Certainly. Sorry? I can't.
What were the pipes made of?
Pipes. I think they, in the main, they were lead-lined wood, and they'd be open. So they were open. They were like what we call launders. So it'd be wood and probably lead lines. So they wouldn't be pipes as we know them. They'd be open. They'd be three-sided pipe, if you like. Okay, they'd be open, but there'd be a cover over it for rain. So it would be open, but there'll be a small cover over it, and they'd call them launders basically. And there'd be miles of those because when it went from one process to another, when it was in liquid form, that's how they moved it until it became nitroglycerine. Then they moved it in buckets to go to the mixing areas. Dodgy stuff, nitroglycerine. Don't want to mess with that. Right, where are we on this? Let's have a look. Now you can see the different from. You can see you've only got to move the camera around, and all of a sudden the things disappear, and so you can see it doesn't show up very well because the light's behind me there, so there's no shadow. When you start getting a bit of shadow, you can see the whole thing sort of gets a 3D effect. Has anybody got any questions on any of that at the moment? So when we talk about bunds, these are the bunds or revetments. These are the man-made, parts of which they're still. Now, a lot of them are eroded. Some of the ones around here, they are quite eroded. As it happens, some of them, these up here are pretty good. And they go all the way around there and come back up this end as well. So they are some of the best examples. There's some quite good examples down here as well. There's some very good examples out in the outer area which we use for storage. Okay, so there's some very good examples there. But the ones around this area here, they're very old, of course, as well. They've got slightly eroded over the years. I mean, they're well over 100 years old now, and there's been no protection or preservation. And with the rabbits and all the other bits and pieces, so they've lost that sort of sharp edge to them. But where they do show up quite well in certain areas, and those are cartridging huts all the way around there. And it's depending where the light hits them.
Can I ask you a question?
Carry on.
Where did the raw materials come from?
Well, they'd all come in. They would come in by rail. Okay, but they made nitric acid on the site, okay, from sulfuric acid. I think the sulfuric acid might have been brought in, but they could make most of what gun cotton they could make on site from cotton waste and nitric acid, so they could make that on site. The earth would have been brought in by rail at the time as well, and some of that originally it would have come from abroad. But eventually they found they had deposits in this country, and then they eventually found replacements for it. May not have been 100% as good, but it was good enough. But they made most of the stuff on site. The acids, which was the main product, they would make that on site. But that's a mega subject in its own. I don't go there. But you can read up about that quite easily. But the thing is that. So this shows. You can see these areas here most of these are cordite drying areas, so they're quite large and they were quite late. And they show up quite well in that angle. So this isn't part of the process area here. This is part of the storage and drying area down on the flat. So the site was quite good at making what it needed. In actual fact, they used to bring in bales of cotton waste. And they would bring in. I think they actually made the acid on site eventually, so they were pretty well self-contained. And the railway line, which went right down to North Quay basically, where it joined. In fact, the railway line, which it goes down and eventually crosses the recreation ground. And there it joins up with the original railway line that went up to Angaric Incline, which then went to Hayle, Towans. So it sort of joined up. It joined up with the, and which is now that went, and of course now is the Memorial Walk effectively. So the bit that went from here down to the recreation ground was new, and then it joined up with what the old Angaric Incline railway line that ran from Gwynia down to eventually to the Hayle Wharves. Now there's a little bridge that runs across, not Little Lethen Lane, near it's still there, where this railway line crosses the little river there, and that's if you come down from Phillock, and before you get to the actual recreation ground, turn left. I think it's a one-way system now towards the new estate there. You go down there, and about 50 yards down, you look in the first or the second house there, you can see the bridge, and it's still there. Lots of people don't know it's there. It's amazing. What else have we got here? We must have something else coming up. Oh, that's just another.
Peter,
Hang on a minute. Yeah.
what was the security line?
Well, I think now the problem is, because the main production after when they went over to Cordite was wartime, there's no records.
Really?
There's no site records. There's nothing at all. There are no site records of what this is a bit of a problem. So a lot of this is you have to sort of trying to work your way around what's what. And there are no accurate drawings or plans from the wartime production at all. Or basically, I think they used to use, there was horses kept on site because there was a stables. We'd be walking past that on the walk, and there was definitely a lot of horses used on site. I would imagine that, to be honest, the best way to police that would have been on horseback, quite frankly, because it was fenced. There are remnants of the fence there, but it would have been very, very difficult. So I think it was mainly policed by it. But of course, we're talking about First World War now, when there wasn't the mechanisation. You weren't worried about rubber boats coming up from the sea, and they didn't have to worry about things like that. So it would have been well contained. There's no doubt about it. And if it ever went into a store, when it was a finished product, and it was a magazine, and there's still a few magazines still left here, which were still used actually after the war, as it happens. Only the magazines. The rest of the site was destroyed. But some of the magazines are still there. They're very solid, concrete, constructed which would have had steel doors. So they would have been fairly safe. They would have just had very, very stout doors. You see here, you can see these are all cartridging huts here and down there. So it shows up quite well there. And see that one there shows up quite well. But you can't walk to a particular thing and say, oh yeah, that was done here, that was done there, because it evolved, it changed right up until basically it stopped. So, and there are no accurate plans for that, which makes it quite challenging. Hang on, let's see. I don't know what's coming up next. The future. Something. Right.
Another question, Peter.
Go on, carry on. Sorry? How with what?
How did it cope with the Cornish weather?
Oh, you can see they're in huts. They weren't out in the open. So, I mean, the processes were all in huts, in wooden huts. So there's no problem there. And the pipes, the open launders would have had covers over them as well, and it was because it was making it continuously. They couldn't say, oh, it's raining, we won't do anything. So I think it wasn't really a problem, I don't think. But there's not really any records of it. They really aren't. The wartime thing really did rather scupper all that, and I think when they actually demolished the site, which is what they did, they demolished the site, didn't decommission it, they demolished it, and they also did away with all the records at the same time. ICI didn't want anything left. That's why they couldn't open it up again when the next war came along, which then became the Second World War. There was nothing there to rebuild, so it could never be used. It was never used again after 1918. It was never used again because there was nothing there to use. Now, what does that tell us? Oh, yeah, well, of course it's still there, right. So, in actual fact, what's there's there, and it hasn't changed, basically. The buildings have gone, and a lot of the bits and pieces have been, stolen, and a few bricks have been. They don't steal the bricks down there because apparently the acid doesn't make them very usable for onward use, apparently. So that's why some of those brick walls are still there. But they certainly destroyed anything that was relatively useful. The wooden buildings would have gone and sold off. But of course, what they didn't bother to do, they didn't bother to do away with the revetments and the bunds. So the bunds are our clue, what goes on. We know how the process works, so you can work out from where the bunds are what went on in a particular area. But of course, there's nothing in the bund to say what went on. Some have got small mounts for engines. That means probably it was used for drying, because there would have been some sort of fan or something there. But a lot of the processes were handmade, so they didn't need any mechanisation at all. So it is quite challenging walking around, as you'll see when we go around there. So it was decommissioned or eradicated, whatever you want to call it. But in actual fact, some of the storage magazines were utilised up until the 60s. They left a few of those. There must have been a reason for that. Perhaps whether I see. So some of the storage magazines were left, and they were used up to the 60s to store dynamite, which was brought in, of course, from outside. Came into Dynamite Key, a lot of that, and also black powder because Tucking Mill made fuses. There's a well-known fuse works down in Tucking Mill, and they were still using black powder for fuses, and so they used to store that there while the fuse works were still going. Then eventually it got passed to Cornwall Council, and so it's actually owned by Cornwall Council now, and the Cornwall Wildlife Trust acts as the stewards. So when we go there now, it's in its 1918 time warp, effectively. And apart from that, one concrete building near the entrance, which was a later addition. But you can see where the cordite presses were. There's still some bits and pieces. You can actually identify certain bits of foundations. They've got some very, very substantial rods and screwed things in where they were being screwed down, and they've lasted particularly well. There have been huge engines there. There have been steam engines, compressors, and all that. All the bases for those are still there. It would be quite an interesting exercise for someone to make a model of what went on, because you could actually basically work out what went on some of them by the size of the bolts and things if you were that way inclined. So all that is still there, because there was nothing. They've done away, taken the engines and the buildings away, but the actual foundations are all still there. I think, well, what's coming up next? Let's have a look. I think that's it. I think. Oh yeah, here we are. Right, the walk. Right, the clues in the word New Nitro Hill. Yeah, now hill is a bit of a clue, really. It means you've got to walk up this slope. So we'll be coming into the site at the gate. We'll be turning left, walking along the old railway line, past the platform. Then we'll be looking across into the woods to see there's an old wrecked house there where the horses were kept. And then we'll be turning right and going up a gentle. I'll take you up a gentle slope. It may, if it's a bit damp, it might be slippery. Wear grippy shoes. But I will take you up a gentle way, because it can be quite slippery. It should be all right at that time of the day, but just be warned, okay? But I'll take you up a gentle way, and we'll end up at the top of New Nitro Hill, and then we'll work our way down there, because you'll see a lot of the things from there. We'll walk through where they did the cartridging, so you're able to go into an actual cartridging bund and see where they work there. We'll then work our way across to the other side, to Jack Straw's area, and that's a much more gentle stroll up there to see the original production area, and we'll see where the explosions were there and walk down through that, and then we'll end up in the cordite area, and then we'll be back at the chimney again. So it's an ongoing sort of entertainment, in as much as trying to decide. Nobody knows exactly what went on in every particular area there, because there are no records. A very good friend of mine, Brian Earle, knew quite a lot, but even he didn't know what went on in everywhere, because it's such a big location. So without any plans, it makes it very, very difficult. And as regards the tramming, or what they call it, there's only one place where there's any remotely evidence of any track after all those. And most of those would have been pushed around, it wouldn't have been like a little steam engine or locomotive. They would have been pushed around. And a lot of those, and some of the tracks would have been wood if it was in a critical area. And so that's obviously all gone. So very, very little of the track would have been metal. When the people went to work on the site, they had to be virtually searched on the way in and out. So they weren't wearing anything that was that could cause a spark. So it was all part of the safety culture. So people had to be very careful what they wore, and that was part of. And they were inspected on the way in, and mainly on the way in, obviously, to make sure they weren't wearing anything. Women couldn't have hat pins or hairpins and things like that, because that wouldn't be allowed. Anything that could cause a spark would not have been allowed in the production area. Now, I don't know where they are with this now, but it was being proposed as becoming a scheduled a monument. I'm not quite sure what's happened about that. Because it was going to be an ongoing. So the whole site was proposed to be a scheduled monument. So I'll try and find out before the walk if anything's happened, because there's no interpretation signs down there, unfortunately. So it makes it quite difficult for people to know where they are and what they're doing. They have done a bit of clearance there recently, so the little incline going up to the top of New Nitro Hill does show up quite well now, but we won't be walking up there because it's a little bit steep. What have we got coming? Oh, we've got another bing. Yeah. So there's an incline there. Now, for those who are keen, I mean, the whole thing is designed that when you can go back again at your leisure and have a wander around, at least you've got an idea of what went on. So that's where the acid tanks were, and that's where the wagons would have been dragged up. There's a little winch base there, so that's a little incline there. There'll be a compressed air motor or something there, and then that was then transferred into the acid tanks. And that's where the process started.
Do you know who Jack Straw was?
Well, they reckon this chap Gutman. They reckon it was a pub he used in Blackheath, where he came from. You can read. There's plenty of. That was where the name come, because there was a pub at Blackheath called, and that's where. And so they reckon where it started from. There's no local connotation for it. I mean, it started in '88 and it was all gone by 1920. A very short life, but the cordite production really did shoot it into stratospheric sort of numbers as regards, and that's why it's such a big site. Because cordite needs to be dried, so you needed a lot of space to have all these areas where you could dry them. And you can see some of it depends on the time of year. Some of the area shows up quite well, but others it blends into the basic towns area, which makes it quite challenging.
You said that the process involved washing.
Sorry?
You said the process involved washing. Was that seawater?
Well, it was to wash out, yes, because you mix the glycerine with the nitric acid. And then to form an oil, and then what you're basically then, once it's formed into this oily compound, you're basically then removing the traces of the acid, basically, and that's.
Where did the water come from? Was it seawater?
No, the water would have been. There was plenty of water on site here from the old mines in the area, so I think there's a couple of mines there, and so they could utilise water from that, and then that acid could be reused. Funnily enough, it's really weird. So once the glycerine and the nitric acid had nitrated, which is a chemical process, and I'm not going in there because we'll be here for another week, and it's not about all that. That whole process, you could spend hours talking about that, But there's plenty of things on Wikipedia and things you can read about that if you want to. But once you've nitrated, then you're left with, and the oil is formed. You've got to separate the oil from the basis, from what's left of the acid and other sort of waste products, if you like. And the oil, because what happens, the oil, it's called an oil. Nitroglycerine is called an oil, and that will come to the top, and it can be floated and skimmed off. And that's done. They would call that washing and pre-washing, or pre-washing and washing. And then you're left with the pure, which is slightly opaque oil. It's because it feels like an oil. That's the pure nitroglycerine, and that's what's used to make both the dynamite and the cordite. And remembering that cordite is different from dynamite in it doesn't explode as quickly or as violently, which is why it's used in armaments.
Peter, sorry, can
I knew he'd have a go. Go on.
Well, a lady was
This is not just a pointer, you know, it's a laser.
The lady was asking about the fresh water. Well, Oliver Gutman, when he went over there, that's how it was. He chose that site.
Yes, because of the mines.
Because the Boiling Well.
Boiling Well, yeah.
Boiling Well mine was an old lead mine.
Yeah.
And that had fresh water, lots
Yeah.
of it. And that's why they needed fresh water up in the sand. That's where is a main mine.
So they had everything. I mean, it was an ideal site. It was an ideal site for what they wanted. And it probably didn't cost very much either, because it was basically, well, you could just, to all intents and purposes, it was barren land, really. It wasn't agricultural. But the same company had been producing gunpowder at Kennel Vale down at Ponds and Uth, which was a completely different process. That required them to have water mills and grind the components that we've talked about, saltpeter and sulfur, etc. That in itself was dangerous, but a completely different process from this. This was more like a chemistry-based process, whereas down at Kennel Vale making gunpowder, it was using natural products and incorporating them, grinding them into a powder form. But they did remarkably well making the transition from gunpowder to dynamite. They did remarkably well because there was nothing really to sort of, you know, like I say, you couldn't go down to the library and buy a book on it. This chap Gutman, who was brought in, he did an amazingly good job. But the really impressive thing was the safety culture, that they did it with very relatively lack of loss of life. That is its testament to how well it was designed, really, and and not just how they designed it, but how they ran it, the safety culture, checking people going on and off the site, and the way they handle things, only allowed to move very small quantities around in any one time, only allowing a few people to work in any particular. These cartridging huts here, only 2 people in a lot of these, only 2 people working. So if there was an explosion, sad as it was, it would only take 2 out. You wouldn't get an explosion here going boom, 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 going all the way round. It wouldn't start off a sympathetic explosion. It would be contained, and contained in that area. So they did very well, I think. Really, I think they did amazingly well. And cordite, of course, went on to be used, or still used now. So when I say we went from an era of muskets, Drake, Nelson, gunpowder plot, it went from that era, and within a very few years it was being used in rockets, ejection seats, and of course it's still used in forms of it are still used in munitions nowadays. It's slightly different now, and things have changed again, but it's still a product that's used now.